Good morning. So my name is Jeanette Prince, and I'm the chair of the CX Snow Load Committee. Unfortunately, my co-presenter, Abby Lyle, could not be here this morning, so I'm going to cover all of the content. So please bear with me as we go through some of the more technical stuff. Abby has said that she is available by email to answer questions afterwards. And what we can do with that, if we get a lot of questions that we think would be helpful for the group, that are things that I'm unable to answer, we can publish those in the CX newsletter with responses. So before I start, I do want to thank John Fentman, Michael Rourke, and Brendan Bean and Jim Harris for sharing their slides with us. A lot of these slides are from the presentation that was given at Structures Congress in April. So I want to thank them for helping us put this together. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about national reliability targeted ground snow loads, wind chill windiness and drifts, some changes to the thermal factor, and then wrap that all up with what it means for us here in Colorado. So starting with national ground snow loads. Why are we messing with snow loads in ASC 7? The big reason is they really haven't been touched on a national basis since 1995. So we have a lot more data to be able to look at. We also in ASC 7 have had historically significant case study regions. So we have big areas of the country where ASC 7 wasn't tackling the ground snow loads. It was really up to the individual states. We're getting a lot of inconsistencies when you cross over state lines, which makes it hard to use. I think you all recall back in 2016, Colorado took a look at 50-year mean recurrence interval snow loads for our state and found that they were problematic and that they were not providing uniform reliability across the state. So if you used a 50-year MRI snow load in the plains and used it in the mountains, you were getting structures with different reliability indices. And we want all of our structures to be equally safe. So we changed back in 2016 to what we call uniform risk instead of uniform hazard snow loads as a basis for our state. And now the whole country has looked at what Colorado has done and said, you know what, we should be doing that too. So they've done what we've started back a few years ago. So this just kind of shows you the amount of case study regions that were out there. And then this is what we currently see in ASC 716. We have a bunch of areas, especially the Mountain West, that were locally generating their ground snow loads. And then we had some others that were just based off the ASC 710 loads. What that meant for 716 is that we have these blue areas that were still defined as case studies, and then red areas where they just deferred to the state as a whole. And Colorado was one of those. So if you go in ASC 716, there are tabulated loads for about 50 places in Colorado. Those come straight from the 2016 Colorado ground snow load report, and it references that report as well. So they put together this ground snow load task group, and Abby Lyle, who again couldn't be here today, but sends her regrets, was co-chair of that committee. And there was a lot of support from Utah State and the University of Nebraska to help run a lot of the statistical analysis. And their goal is to really make accurate predictions of ground snow loads across the whole country. And they started by collecting historic data and looking at that data set and seeing what they had. And then the next piece was, how do you take that and then extrapolate and predict snow loads in spots where you don't have a station measuring what the snow loads are. They also made a big effort to do all these analyses in a way where they've created tools that are automated, where we can easily plug in new data as it comes up so that we can keep maintaining things instead of having to start all over again if we want to update the study. This obviously took a lot of funding, and a lot of the state organizations contributed to this effort. So these are all the people who are on the snow load task group. I do want to point out that we had pretty heavy representation from Colorado. Abby, of course, was the chair, but Jared DeBach, who's at Chico State, he was on our SEAC snow load committee and ran most of the numbers for us in 2016. He used to work for J.R. Harris before he went over to Chico State, Jim Harris, of course, and then both Bruce Ellingwood of Colorado State and I did the high-level peer review piece for sort of the approach about moving to the reliability targeted loads and some of the snow water equivalency work that was done. And of course, Jennifer Goupil on ASC staff is also based in Colorado. So this is just an image of the different spots where they had data, so pretty well distributed across the country. And then the big piece is not just how much snow there is, but what we really care about is how much does the snow weigh? And that's always been a challenge. And I think you know that in Colorado, we tried to solve that problem by having two different density functions, one for the plains, where our snow load really is the effect of settled snow, so a single storm, and as opposed to mountains where things can be denser, because you've got compacted snow, right? The snow load that we're designing for is a result of several storms that build up over time. So what this shows is sort of some different representative places across the country where they took the SWE, snow water equivalency information that they had, and then looking at how we're going to describe that relationship in the code. So the purple line down at the bottom is what was in ASC 7, the Tobiasen relationship, and you can see that that purple line, at least for these couple of spots that we're indicating here, did not match the data very well. And then in contrast, we have this green line, which was what the Colorado relationship was that we defined for the mountains, so our high altitude equation. And then you can see the orange line that is what was done nationally for this effort. And it has some advantages over what we did, is we had a couple different equations and we had a line that we set that we said, well, once you're west of this line or above this altitude, you're going to use this equation. Down here, you're going to use that equation. This relationship doesn't have a line of demarcation. It's really based on a whole bunch of factors with climate, and it also has to do with time of year, which is what you can see in these slides as well, because sometimes a really heavy wet spring snow is going to have a different density than a fall snow and a drier snow, and what does that look like? This is just another slide with some different areas. Salt Lake and Brighton and Utah are probably a little more analogous to what we see going on in Colorado, and you can see again how the different models matched well, perhaps with the old equation to some of the Salt Lake numbers, but again, those were too low for some of the Brighton numbers. If you all recall back to 2016 that we talked about as well, we also have different distributions for our snow and our plains and the mountains, so what all that looks like. What this really illustrates is if you pay attention to the axis over on the y-axis, you can see that across the country you get very different densities for the same load, right? So you can have the same load, but you have very different depths depending if you're in Minnesota or if you're in New York versus Maryland. So this again stresses the importance of why it doesn't make sense to just use one equation for a snow to depth. It's not snow to depth, a load to depth ratio for snow across the country, because there's so much variation in what you get. So this map shows what they did with those probability models across the US, and the color coding has to do with shape factors. So things that have the same color have the similar probability models for that snow-water equivalency relationship. When you look at the map, you can tell that it really addresses a lot of the sort of climate factors that play into how snow behaves and a lot of geographic features across the country. So reliability targeted ground snow loads, we talked about that a little bit already, and I'm just going to briefly go over what that means for anyone that isn't quite up to speed on what we've been doing here in Colorado. And again, the whole idea is that you have a probability density function for load and you have one for resistance, and we're really interested in when those two cross over, because the area where those two cross over represents the probability of failure for a structure, and we're trying to get that within what we would consider to be an acceptable range. So what was the problem with uniform hazard loads or 50-year MRI loads? The problem is that what we're trying to look at with reliability analysis is we want kind of that typical blue curve, which would be a beta of 3, which is what we target for risk category 2 structure, and we say, well, that has an acceptable probability of failure, where that overlap is small enough in between the resistance and the load. But the problem is that snow loads don't really follow that type of distribution that we're trying to target. So when we look at our northern or mountainous places, especially in Colorado, you get more of this red distribution, again, because it tends to normalize a little bit because it's the accumulation of several storms. And you're getting a beta that's higher than the target. So, we're always being accused of over-designing, etc. So perhaps we are slightly in those regions. But in the plains and the mid-Atlantic, when they ran those numbers, we have what I would consider a more serious problem, in that we have a beta of 2, which is much less than what we should be looking at for structures and not what our target reliability is set at. So they took everything, and now we have a nationwide map of reliability targeted loads. So the idea is you use these loads for design, you're going to get a beta of 3 no matter where you are in the country for risk category 2 building. So you can tell this map, this is a hard to read map. So they have created this ASC 7 hazard tool, and this is free online. And I don't remember the link, I should put it up there, but you can Google just ASC 7 hazard tool and it'll pop up, and you go in there and you put in your address, you put in your risk category, and it'll pop up for you your ASC 7 loads for wind, snow, seismic, and you can pick which version of the code you're designing under. So it's very convenient. What I pulled up here today is for the address where we are today, and you can see the information that pops up, and we'll talk a little bit more about what those different things are in a moment. So what does that mean? Well, now that we're going with a reliability targeted load, that's really an ultimate approach in terms of design. So instead of trying to factor it down to ASD and mapping ASD and then putting factors to bring it back up to LRFD, the maps are all mapped in terms of strength design, which is similar to what's happened with wind in recent years. So that means that the load combinations in the code have changed accordingly. So now since it's a strength level snow load that we're looking at on the maps, the load factor is 1 in the LRFD combos. And when you go to the ASD combos, it has a factor of 0.7 on it. Similarly to what happened with wind, you remember that there's not an importance factor anymore. Now we have a different map for each risk category. They did the same thing with snow. And the reason is because you're targeting a different beta as you move up in your risk category. And the relationships between those is not something that you can just put a factor on to get the equivalent load. So they have separate maps, and you, again, with the hazard tool, you can pick your risk category, and it'll pop up what the appropriate ground snow load is for that risk category. So that has some trickle-down effects to some other things in the code. I do want to point out that a lot of these changes are not substantive changes. They're more compatibility changes. So when we look at, for example, there's an equation in the code for the minimum snow load on the roof, and then there's a table that has, I would call the maximum minimum, which is maybe a little bit confusing, but you don't have to go over a set number for those low slope roofs. The numbers are higher than they used to be. So for risk category 2, and now it says 30 instead of 20. Well, it says that because it's a strength level load instead of an ASD load. So in terms of what we're actually designing our roof for the minimum, that's not changing. It's just compatibility with, are we looking at strength versus ASD. And then we're going to get into some pieces about the drift relationships, because I think you all recall the importance factor is in the current drift relationship, and so that has to go away. Also, a affected some other chapters of the code that reference snow, like seismic. In certain areas, you have to take a certain percentage of the snow load as part of your effective seismic weight. Again, this isn't a real change. This is a change to go from snow being an ASC load versus a strength load. So you'll see that ratio there is just that 0.7 ratio. Another important thing to look about when you're talking about reliability loads is what are you going to use for service design? And is your ASD load appropriate for service design? And I think you recall back in the 2016 ground snow load report, we said, the annual probability of exceedance or 50-year MRI load for the mountains was very similar to what we were saying was a good design load there. But in the plains, most years we don't get dumped on, but every now and then we do. So we have to design for that kind of that long tail, that heavier load from a safety perspective, but is it really appropriate to be using that as a serviceability perspective? So in the appendix of our report for Colorado, we had some equations that you could take the loads and adjust them down to a 50-year MRI load for something that might be a little bit more reasonable to use for service. ASC 7 is taking a similar approach. They've always suggested in the commentary of ASC 7 that you should be using for design a load with a 5% annual probability of exceedance when you're checking serviceability. So in ASC 716, it says dead plus half snow. Now that's an issue in compatibility with the IBC because the IBC says you use dead plus snow, not half snow. ASC 7 is being consistent with itself and has published 20-year MRI snow loads and that corresponds to a 5% annual probability of exceedance, and those are in the hazard tool. I have some concerns with those because they're fairly low, and I think you really have to think about what deflection limits you should be using with those, and we don't yet know what the 2024 IBC is going to say, which will be the code that adopts ASC 722. So this is an area that the Snow Load Committee is going to be working on this year to talk about, does that make sense to come down to a 20-year MRI for serviceability for Colorado, or should we be more at 50, which I think most of us are a little more comfortable with. So one of the big advantages of this study and the approach is that they were able to eliminate the area of a lot of the case study regions. So there's still some case study regions, but they're just these blue dots. So it's about 90% less area of case study than what was in the 716. So basically the case studies have been performed for those states. We do have some of these case study areas in Colorado. Most of these locations are above the tree line, and the problem is that we have data at certain elevations, and then when you want to extrapolate and there's no data for really high elevations, that it's difficult to extrapolate to. So what does this mean across the country for the actual loads that we're putting on the roof? It's not a huge difference for a lot of the country. You can kind of see this box plot. There are some big ranges, but the average ratio is a 5% increase, but some are a little lower and some are a little bit higher. And really the higher ones are, I would say, mostly those areas where we had that low reliability index that was a concern. So now I'm going to talk about another change in the code, which is the winter wind parameter. And what this has to do is it affects how we calculate snow drifts. And I think, I don't have data, but I would say anecdotally, most of the issues that we see with roofs are not because they were under-designed from a uniform snow load perspective. It's really from an unbalanced snow load perspective and a drifting perspective. So these are some pictures that Jim has from some drifts in Colorado with some buildings that had issues. So what creates drift? Well, you have to have wind in order to create drift. And in the past, the drift equations had come from some insurance case studies where there had been some failures, and they went and took a look at the drifts and the shape of the drifts, and that's where those equations came from. But they took those failures, and then they made a drift equation, and then they applied it to everywhere in the country. That's what we've been using for many years. Well, it doesn't necessarily make sense that everywhere in the country country might have the conditions during the winter that could cause those drifts. So these are the old equations. What they've done with the update is they've actually done a model with what it looks like to create drift. Part of what they're looking at is the transport rate, like the wind that picks up and blows the particles to create the drift, and then what they call the trapping efficiency, how much can get caught in whatever roof projection or we're looking at that's going to capture some drift. So they took a look at actual weather data from multiple winters, and then they ran some statistical analyses, and then they tried to define a parameter for what's going on here and how is the wind affecting the drift. So they looked at a lot of different things, but the one they ended up settling on in terms of simplicity was this W2 parameter. And what that represents is the percentage of time during the winter months that the wind speed is over 10 miles per hour. Because if it's less than 10 miles per hour, that's not enough to pick up the snow and blow it and create a drift. So it's not a perfect parameter. It doesn't really take into account the strength of the wind or the wind speed. Like once you get up above that 10 mile per hour threshold, it doesn't really account for wind direction. But I would say it's a step in the right direction in that it really tries to look at what's going on in a particular location. So what this means is that on average, the drift loads are coming down for the most part, because again, they were based on some insurance studies from some very specific locations, and perhaps that was overly conservative to apply everywhere. There are some spots that have high winter wind parameters, and those the drift heights have gone up some. So there's a map of these parameters, and one thing that is an issue for Colorado is it does say, these winter wind parameters, they were created by looking at the different airport data across the country, and then they drew their contours. They really shouldn't be applied in special wind regions. And as you know, we've got the Colorado Front Range Gust Map. We have a big area where we have a lot of buildings that are in a special wind region. So that's another piece that SEAC is going to need to take a look at and see what do we want to do about the winter wind parameter, because we don't want to bring our drifts down if they shouldn't be coming down. The winter wind parameter does show up in the ASC 7 hazard tool. I have a couple of issues with the hazard tool that we've been talking to ASC 7 about, and part of that is when you saw the previous map, it's all shown as the winter wind parameter would be 0.35, right? It's 35% of the time that we've got those higher wind speeds. The ASC 7 tool, they've left the decimal off, but you have to put the decimal back in to enter the equations, or you're going to get crazy numbers. So that's one area of caution. The other area of caution is the hazard tool right now isn't flagging you with a winter wind parameter when you're in a special wind region. So, I ran it for Boulder, Louisville, some different places, where we get some high winds and we're in a special wind region, and it will give you a winter wind parameter. So be careful and say don't use it yet until we're able to make some Colorado-specific recommendations. So what does this look like? So I've taken our location here today and arbitrarily made up some numbers with an upwind fetch of 60 feet for a drift calculation, and just looked at exposure factor and thermal factor of 1. You take a look at the old ASC 716 equation. We had a ground snow load for this location of 40 pounds per square foot. You put that into the equations, and you get that the flat roof snow load is 28 pounds per square foot, and you get a drift that's 57 psf and about 12 feet wide on the base of that triangle. When we go to the new ASC 722 loads, they actually correlate quite well with what we had for Colorado for ground snow load. The ground snow load is now 55 psf, but remember that's a strength level load. So when we look at the 0.7 of the flat roof load, so an ASC load combination, we get 27 psf. So the flat roof load is the same as what we had before, but when we enter the wind equation, and if we assume that what they are showing is correct for the wind parameter in Westminster, we get a shorter drift with less load. And then just to show you how the winter wind parameter affects that, also run it for what they're showing for Louisville, which has a higher winter wind parameter, and you can see the drift comes up significantly and is longer as well. Which makes sense because if you look at the equation, the winter wind parameter is the one that has the biggest impact, is the one that has the largest exponent on it in the equation. Another change in the code when you're looking at drifts has to do with these intersecting drifts. Now, this piece was in ASC 716, but they clarified a little bit for where this applies. And so I've got that portion of the text underlined. So before it just said reentrant corners and parapet wall corners, but now they've added intersections of gable roofs with a roof step wall of a taller roof and other similar geometries. And they've also been a little clearer about what does it mean to have the larger of the two snow drifts. Now it says larger of the two snow drift depths, just to be clear about what they were talking about there. And the reason they did this is they had some collapses of school buildings with heavy snow in 2015 in Boston, and a lot of that was due to intersecting drifts. But the intersecting drifts that they found on those collapses were not ones that were adequately described by the ASC 716 code. They were happening at these locations that they've now added into 722, where intersecting drifts were occurring. So just to kind of remind all of us that we need to be taking those things into account. We also have a lot of roofs that have solar panels on them. ASC 7 doesn't have particular guidance for what to do for drifts around that, but the commentary does have some references to some papers that were done by O'Rourke that does tell you what to do with those drifts. So that might be something that people are interested in looking into. So I think probably the most straightforward of the updates is the updated thermal factor. So if we look at this, the thermal factors were first incorporated into the code, I would say, back in 1995. And back then, we're looking at cold ventilated roofs with the thermal resistance factor greater than 25. You needed to have a little bit of an upgraded thermal factor because, the snow on the roof would be closer to the snow on the ground because it's not melting off due to the heat of the structure escaping. I think, as we all know, our energy codes keep getting tighter and tighter, and we keep getting higher R values and insulation requirements on our buildings. So what we're seeing in the built environment today is not what the code was calibrated to. So this is the new table in the code. And so a piece of this is the same, where we have unheated or open air structures still have a CSFT of 1.2. But now these structures kept just above freezing and other structures with cold ventilated roofs are also 1.2. That used to be 1.1. And then the other piece, the all other structures, which is what most of my buildings have been, used to have a CSFT of 1.0. Now we have to go to a table. So the table has to do with the magnitude of the ground snow load. Again, remember strength level, ground snow load, and the R on the roof for the building. So in Colorado, in sort of the Front Range area, like I said, here in Westminster, we've got that strength level ground snow load of 55 PSF. And the energy code right now would be requiring at least an R of 30 for a structure here. So we're in this 1.1 range on our thermal factor. If you're looking in the mountains, where our ground snow loads are going to be up above 70, and our requirements are more around 35, you're also going to be sort of in that 1.12 range. So something to take a look at. So in conclusion, I think that they've made a lot of good strides overall by really trying to make the snow load provisions more in line with the other environmental hazards in the code, so there's a more consistent approach. I think there's a big advantage in trying to go with uniform reliability. More design, got more information to address some of the climatic differences that contribute to drifts. So taking into account wind, I think that's a positive piece, and the thermal factors that are consistent with what we're seeing with today's buildings and energy codes are good as well. However, I would say I don't think this is quite ready to use yet in most of Colorado without a little more vetting. I mean, we talked about how drifts really are key in looking at potential issues with your roofs, and the winter wind parameter really factors into what those drifts are. So need to take a look at Colorado to see what the winter wind parameter should be in our special wind region. Also, so I've done a little bit of spot checking with some of the loads, and as you saw for Westminster, they correlate very well to what we had. But they don't correlate quite as well in some of the mountain locations, and we need to look into that and see what's going on there. Is that because they have a better snow-water equivalency relationship than what we had come up with? Or is there something that we need to take a closer look at? So, for instance, Glenwood, Telluride, Aspen, Vail, some of these spots have significant differences with what's published, and I'm not sure that I would endorse using those loads quite yet, but we do have a commitment as a committee to go through all of that and publish something for all of you to be able to use by the end of the year. I think we have a big advantage in that, like I said, Abby is the chair of the National Task Force, and we have good relationships with all the people who nationally ran the data, so it should be pretty easy for us to dig in there and figure out what's going on. If you're interested in reading more about this, there have been a couple of articles published in Structure Magazine going over the changes, and then I always like to recommend O'Rourke's design guide that he publishes, which runs through a bunch of example problems about how to apply the code and what it really looks like for calculating unbalanced loads. And he's in the process of updating his new guide for 722, and I expect it'll be out later this year. With that, I'll open it up for questions. If there are questions afterwards, you can always email me. You can email Abby. Again, Abby is much more in tune with some of the nuances of the statistical analysis. She's very sorry she couldn't be here today, but she said, by all means, feel free to email the two of us and ask us questions, and that'll help it sort of inform what we're looking at for Colorado going forward. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jeanette. So we don't have any questions from folks online yet. So if you have a question from online, be sure that we do have one. But I'm going to take questions in the room here. And since we do have people online, please wait for the microphone to make sure that they can hear you as well.
Yeah, I'm Landon with Martin. For the winter windiness factor, I guess, aren't our peak drifts typically coincident with our highest wind speeds, oftentimes during like a blizzard, right? Why would an average windiness for the season dictate what we should design our peak drifts for?
And that's why I have some concerns about what we're doing in the special wind region. They looked at 4 different parameters, and I think you all know that when things go into the code, there's a lot of validating and committee work and arguing. Shall we say it's not some magical right number. It's about what is a wind parameter that can easily be applied over most of the country. And so I think one of the limitations of the one they've chosen is that it doesn't account for like what you said about the wind speed. It's just saying anytime it's over 10 miles per hour in the winter season, but it, as we all know, back in December in Boulder area, right, Marshall Fire, we had 100 mile per hour winds. And what does that do to, we didn't have any snow at that point in time, but drifting, etc. And so I think that's really why the wind committee needs to take a look at what's going on, especially in those areas in Colorado where we do get those really high wind speeds, and they can happen during the winter. And I'm hesitant to back off on the drifts because of that.
Thank you.
I'm Fred Rutz, and here's my question. Great respect for all the theoretical work that's been done by so many people, so many contributors. My concern is something that's troubled me for many, many years, and that is these complex roofs that we run into, and I think everyone does, particularly high-end residences or high-end hotels that have lots of peaks and valleys and dormers and intersecting corners, and a very irregular, complex geometry. And the code would figure out, with all kinds of different uniformly distributed loads and triangle distributions, and it gets question boils down to this: what's the engineer supposed to do?
Well, I would say, I mean, isn't that the whole part of, maybe a piece of Julian's marketing campaign is we have a lot of information and data and code things, but that's why computers can't do our job for us, right? It's engineering judgment. And I will say, when I'm running into a roof that's very complicated in a lot of those ways, I'll often take what is the peak drift for when those locations say intersecting drift, right? The parapet, but then there's the roof screen on the RTU, and they're all coming together. And, well, here's the peak drift. I'm going to apply that as a uniform load in this section here. I don't think that has a huge cost implication to the structure, especially if we're being smart about what we're trying to do with our deflection limits. I do believe that trying to overcomplicate the analysis too much sometimes works against us in terms of safety of the structure or doing a good job with the structural design. I think these provisions for the drifts are in there to try to alert people to where they should be using something higher and what's going on in the flat roof, because as you've seen, that really has to do with a lot of the collapses. And if you thought about, I don't know too much about the school buildings in Boston, but it makes sense that snow could have been captured in those locations. The letter of the code didn't say snow was captured here, and so it wasn't designed for the intersecting drifts, and they had a collapse, and those are school buildings, and those are high risk category buildings. So that's my personal opinion. I think we all sort of approach and design buildings differently. I see Peter has a question. Peter's in forensics, so maybe he can tell us about what he's seeing out there with issues.
My name is Peter Markshausen. I also want to point out that the last question from Russ was from a perspective of a person that teaches how to use ASCE 7 and feeling that he feels exacerbated sometimes interpreting ASCE 7. That's very comforting debate. And Jeanette, great presentation. Quick question. I don't mean to drag you into political debate, but I think it merits at least a conversation that certain conversations in industry related to snow loads and climate change. There's one perspective on one end that we're getting more variations, and which potentially higher loads that are not predicted in the code. But the exact opposite of the coin is that some people say because of climate change, we're going to see snow loads diminish and that our existing building inventory is over-designed. In your studies, in your meetings, in your conversations, have the long-term projections or long-term trends been considered or even looked at?
I would say that the approach they've taken, I think I talked about this a little bit with the modeling, is that the modeling has been done in a way that as the data shifts and we get new data, it can be incorporated into the models without starting over from scratch. And I think that was very intentional because of what you just said. I think right now it's very hard for us to anticipate what's going to happen. I think what we all are recognizing is that things are perhaps less predictable than they used to be because they're not following patterns of what they used to be. So I don't think there was this, they're working off of the data, historical data sets that they have. There's not this piece about, well, let's add in an extra factor for what we might be seeing in the future, but it is set up in a way that as things shift, like in 10 years, we could take a look at it and say, weather patterns are changing. Maybe we need to come down here or go up there. So that's what I have for you. That. Was there a question from online, Lisa?
Yes, we have a question from Paul. With a larger thermal factor, would you expect the flat roof snow loads to be larger in the 722 than 716 for risk category 2 building in Denver?
I'd say yes, they're going to go up by about 10%.
Not only that, but quantified as well. Thank you. From Eric Richards, for the roof thermal factors, do you feel that determining these values are straightforward based on the architectural roof assembly? And a follow-up, will we be able to look at the architectural roof assembly and determine what the appropriate R value is with relative ease?
Well, and then you're asking me to explain about your architects. I don't know that. I would say that they should be able to define that with relative ease because now they have it in the table with the R values and the U values. And I see Holly's raising her hand, and she has some sustainability stuff as well. I know she's working on, but they have to know those things for the energy modeling of the building, which is really important. So even if they don't have it in the drawings, they should be able to tell you what the answer is. And I did open the energy code to see what it was, and I can tell you what the Colorado is a bunch of different climate regions, but we only have 2 required R values. It's 35 up in the mountains and then 30 down lower. And I think you need to have a conversation with your architects as to whether they're going above and beyond that. I haven't seen a lot of going above and beyond because I've been seeing a lot of complaining about costs, but maybe you see something different. Holly.
Hi, Jeanette. My name is Holly Janowitz. Great presentation. I have a separate question. I think I agree with your answer on that. You mentioned a few things that SEAC needs to look into with the serviceability and the winter wind parameter. And you talked about how SEAC should, or our goal is to then put together some recommendations in the next year. Where do you see that going from there? Just because I can see, even though we put out recommendations, there's still going to be people that are designing to what ASC 722 says if IBC 2024 adopts it. So do you see those recommendations adopted by local jurisdictions, or do you see that being incorporated into the next ASC 7 edition?
I think a little bit of both. I think our easiest approach or most timely approach is really going to be working with our local jurisdictions and our building departments. And so, I think with our last go around, we've had pretty good adoption by a lot of the jurisdictions with our recommended snow loads because the AHJs in Colorado have been looking to SEAC since the 1970s to help them define snow loads. So once we get our recommendations, we do need to go to the Colorado chapter of the ICC and be getting the word out there. I think that's something that we will also, once we have the recommendations, really be leaning on the membership as a whole, just as we have with wind and snow in the past, to help us identify the jurisdictions that aren't really up to speed with what we're recommending and to help us with outreach to try to get that adjusted and shifted. My hope would be if we do find some, the hazard tool right away, we're trying to get that fixed so that it flags for special wind region, so that at least alerts people that maybe they should be thinking a little more about it. With some of the discrepancy with loads, if we can come to an understanding, my hope is that maybe we can get that corrected in an addendum prior to when ASC 722 has to be used, which would be when 2024 IBC is adopted by whatever AHJ you're working with. Eric?
Excuse me,
you have one from online. Okay.
Thanks, Jeanette. From Ann Bonin, how does SEAC plan on educating the various local, smaller jurisdictions on the new snow updates in ASC 722?
Well, I don't have a plan yet, but we talked about that a little bit. On our last go around, Abby and I did a little bit of a tour in that we presented at some of the local chapter meetings for Colorado chapter of ICC. So we went out to Fort Morgan and did a presentation there for one of their meetings. And then we've also been working with the ICC Educational Institute that they hold every year. And there's a big section on snow and wind loads, and we usually steal a portion of that presentation and have been invited in by the person who runs that portion of the Educational Institute and try to get in front of people there. Again, it gets us in front of a lot of people. It doesn't get us in front of everyone, and that's where I think we're going to need your help. And then I would also say working on things where maybe they have a lower load than what SEAC is recommending. I think it's our obligation to design for the higher load if that's what we believe as an industry is white load. I know that we've voted to adopt the 2016 Colorado Ground Snow Loads as an organization. We also had some voting on the Colorado Front Range Gust map. And so I think it's our responsibility to design for something that's higher. When it says lower, we can petition the building department, we can write a letter, we can put in the information, but that might be a spot where we don't have as much leverage. But I do think there potentially the leverage of some of the home builders associations and some other things like that, where they want to be competitive and they don't want higher loads if they think they're unnecessary. So,
Any more questions? Got one in the back here. He's closer.
Tim Hinkish. Following up on this, would there be a reason to have like a letter that we can send out to building officials that talk about the change? I think we've all been involved when the wind changed from service to strength, that we had to educate the building official, and if SEAC as a whole could present a letter that we could present to building officials and say it's not just coming from this one engineer, something other than having to send a long email or long discussions with each building official.
no, I think that'd be great if we can get something together that we post on the SEAC website that engineers can use as a reference and send out. We've had a long history of having a great relationship with the Denver Building Department. They've always invited us into those code updates and changes, and I know Northern Colorado has a good relationship with the building departments out there, but I think that is an area where SEAC could do more. If we have someone who wants to take that up, is to have more of a general building department liaison committee rather than Denver's important, but it's not the only jurisdiction that we're dealing with.
I'm going to follow up on that and say that the building department liaison is one of our committees in SEAC, and we encourage you to get involved. And if this is something that you want to do and have an interest in, such as drafting this letter to the various building departments, this is the place to do it. So
I think there are a lot of things that come out of our committees that could be addressed with something like that. I know our existing building committee has some recommendations that Denver has adopted, but that probably hasn't gotten out to a lot of jurisdictions. Wind, snow, we have a lot of people doing work here that needs to be shared with the larger community, and really trying to have us seen as a resource to help out the jurisdictions, I think is important.
Jeanette, you did a wonderful job of preparing this information. I'm wondering if your presentation will be available for us to receive.
Thanks, Elvis. So yes, Becky is going to send the presentation out to everyone that was here today. And I know I've had a couple people reach out to me separately who weren't able to come. And we're more than happy to share it, so maybe we can post it on the SEAC website for download, and you just talk to the board about what that looks like. We don't have any issue sharing the slides. Like I said, we didn't make most of the slides, but the people who made them said we could share them, so I think we're fine with that.
okay, we have no more questions. So thank you very much, Jeanette. Thank you very much, Sarah. Happy this morning. So once again, I want to say that we appreciate your attendance here. We appreciate you joining us online. We encourage you to continue doing so. At each of the tables, you'll find a list of all of the committees that SEAC has people involved in. Some are much, much more busy and active than others, but if you have an interest in any of them, such as writing a letter to the building officials or working on the existing building committee, which was mentioned today, we can't encourage you enough to get involved. You get out of the organization what you put into it, and I can honestly say I've made a number of wonderful friends and have fun doing it. So with that, we close today, and we'll see you in 2 months. Thank you very much.